Somewhere on the ship you're sailing on right now, there's a room lined with dozens of live video feeds, watching nearly every hallway, elevator, and public space you've walked through since boarding footage. The cruise line is legally required to keep for months after your vacation ends, and you will never, under any circumstances, be allowed to see it. That's just one layer of an entire hidden world of restricted access built into every modern cruise ship doors that simply will not open for you no matter how much you've paid. Rooms that don't appear on any deck plan, and areas so tightly controlled that even asking politely won't get you past the threshold. Some of these restrictions exist for safety. Some exist for legal reasons most passengers never think about. And a few exist purely to protect a version of the ship's operations. The cruise line would clearly rather you never think about it all. Let's go find out exactly what's behind those locked doors. The command center you'll almost never set foot in. For decades, visiting a cruise ship's bridge was a relatively normal part of the experience. Something curious passengers could often arrange with a simple request to a crew member. That changed dramatically after security concerns intensified globally in the early 2000s. Today, the bridge is treated with roughly the same level of restriction as an airplane's cockpit, completely off-limits to passengers, except during specially organized, escorted tours, and even then, usually only while the ship is safely docked in port rather than actively navigating open water. A small number of expedition and boutique cruise lines still maintain what's called an open bridge policy, allowing passengers to visit and chat with officers while the ship is underway. Though even these exceptions close the door immediately the moment weather turns rough, where the ship begins a tricky docking maneuver. Some ships once featured a bridge viewing room, a small enclosed space allowing passengers to peer down and watch officers at work without actually entering the space itself. But many of these have quietly been removed entirely over the years, citing modern health and safety standards. What most passengers never realize is that this restriction exists for a very specific reason. Distraction is genuinely dangerous on a moving vessel. The last thing any captain wants is a curious passenger asking questions at the exact moment officers need to focus entirely on navigating a narrow channel or responding to a sudden change in weather. And if the bridge represents the ship's brain, there's an equally restricted space representing something closer to its beating heart, the room that keeps the whole ship alive. Deep in the lowest decks, far below any guest-accessible area, sits the engine room, a loud, intensely hot, mechanically complex space that keeps the entire vessel powered, moving, and functioning. Access here is even more tightly restricted than the bridge, reserved almost exclusively for engineering staff and specially organized guided tours when a cruise line chooses to offer them at all. Unlike the bridge, where the restriction is largely about avoiding distraction, the engine room's restriction is rooted primarily in genuine physical danger. Massive rotating machinery, extreme heat, high-voltage electrical systems, and a level of noise that requires hearing protection make this an environment where an untrained visitor poses a real safety risk simply by being present. What most passengers never realize is that even senior crew members outside the engineering department typically need specific authorization before entering this space themselves. It isn't just passengers being kept out. It's one of the most tightly access-controlled areas on the entire ship for absolutely everyone who doesn't have a direct operational reason to be there. But not every restricted space aboard a cruise ship exists purely for physical safety. Some exist because of something far less visible: the law itself. The cameras watching everything you do. Here's something most passengers never think about, even though it's happening constantly around them. Cruise ships operate an extensive surveillance network required under federal maritime security legislation, specifically designed to cover virtually every space where passengers and crew have common access. That includes hallways, elevators, public decks, dining rooms, and lounges, though notably, the law specifically excludes private staterooms and crew cabins from this requirement. Under these regulations, footage must be retained for the entire length of the voyage, plus an additional period afterward. And if any crime is reported during that window, the footage has to be preserved for months longer still. Somewhere on every modern cruise ship, there's a dedicated security operations room where trained staff monitor these live feeds continuously, functioning less like a hotel's back office and more like the security command center of a small, self-contained city. What most passengers never realize is that this entire surveillance infrastructure exists specifically because incidents do occur aboard cruise ships: theft, harassment, and occasionally far more serious crimes. And having comprehensive footage isn't just about catching wrongdoing after the fact. It's also, quietly, about protecting the cruise line itself from legal liability. But the actual footage, the control room where it's monitored, and the records of exactly what that footage has captured remain completely off-limits to passengers, no matter how directly a situation might involve them. And in a genuinely modern twist, cruise lines have recently begun restricting something else entirely, not a physical space this time, but a piece of technology passengers are increasingly bringing on board themselves. The new rule nobody saw coming. In 2025 and 2026, multiple major cruise lines began explicitly banning the use of smart glasses in specific areas throughout their ships. Devices capable of discreetly recording video or audio, worn simply as an ordinary pair of glasses, created a genuinely new privacy problem that existing rules never anticipated. Some cruise lines restrict them only in especially sensitive spaces: casinos, spas, medical facilities, security checkpoints, and crew-only areas, while at least one major line has gone further, banning their use across every public space on the entire ship. What most passengers never realize is that this new restriction reveals something important about how quickly cruise lines have to adapt their entire approach to privacy and security as technology keeps evolving. A policy written 5 years ago couldn't have anticipated a passenger wearing what looks like an ordinary pair of sunglasses while secretly recording other guests, crew members, or restricted areas without anyone's knowledge or consent. And once you understand how seriously cruise lines take unauthorized recording, an entirely different category of restricted space becomes easier to understand: the parts of the ship built purely around handling money, the vaults passengers never get close to. Every cruise ship casino operates its own secured cash handling and count room, an area treated with the same seriousness as a bank vault, where cash and chips are tracked, counted, and secured under close supervision. Similarly, restricted back-of-house financial areas exist throughout the ship, handling everything from the daily processing of onboard purchases to payroll for thousands of crew members. These spaces aren't hidden purely for security against theft, although that's certainly part of the reasoning. They're also restricted because of strict regulatory and auditing requirements governing exactly how gambling revenue and onboard financial transactions must be documented and controlled, especially given the complicated, multi-jurisdictional legal status of a casino that only legally operates once a ship enters international waters. What most passengers never realize is that this financial infrastructure runs with a level of formality and regulation most guests would never expect from a vacation experience built around relaxation and fun, an entire hidden accounting operation running quietly in the background of every single sailing. The areas that exist purely to keep guests out of the way, beyond security and safety. An enormous amount of restricted space aboard a cruise ship exists simply because the ship needs somewhere to function without guests wandering through it. Provisioning and receiving areas, where hundreds of tons of food and supplies are loaded during each port call, remain completely off-limits to passengers, both for basic safety around heavy equipment and pallets, and because the sheer chaos of a loading operation isn't something any cruise line wants a paying guest walking through by accident. Crew-only corridors, connecting kitchens, storage rooms, and staff quarters throughout the lower decks are similarly restricted, not out of secrecy exactly, but because allowing passenger foot traffic through a space designed purely for efficient staff movement would slow down virtually every operational process on the ship. What most passengers never realize is that even senior crew members respect an unspoken hierarchy of access throughout the ship, with different departments restricted from certain crew-only spaces belonging to other departments entirely. The entire vessel operates on a carefully layered system of who's allowed where, and passengers occupy only the outermost, most polished layer of that structure. The records you'll never be shown. Beyond physical spaces, there's an entire category of restricted access that has nothing to do with locked doors at all. Information. Medical records generated by the ship's onboard clinic remain strictly confidential, just as they would at any hospital on land, meaning even a passenger directly involved in a medical emergency alongside another guest will never be given details about that other person's condition or treatment. Security incident reports, internal investigations into onboard disputes, and detailed statistics on things like theft, harassment complaints, or passenger falls are treated as internal cruise line records, rarely if ever shared publicly in the kind of detail an outside observer might expect. Certain figures, like sanitation inspection scores, are technically part of public record through government maritime health programs. But the far more detailed internal reports behind those simplified scores stay entirely within the cruise line's own files. What most passengers never realize is that this information restriction often frustrates journalists, researchers, and even grieving families far more than any locked door ever could. A room you can't enter is at least visibly there. A record you're not permitted to see simply disappears from view entirely, leaving only the cruise line's own carefully worded public statements behind. Why all of this restriction actually makes sense. Step back, and a clear pattern emerges across every single one of these restricted spaces. Some exist purely for physical safety, the engine room's dangerous machinery, the bridge's need for total focus during navigation. Others exist because of legal and financial obligations. Most passengers never think to question the surveillance requirements, the casino's regulatory demands. And still others exist simply because a ship this size, carrying thousands of people, genuinely cannot function if every space remains open to public wandering. None of it is really about secrecy for its own sake. It's about an enormously complex operation, hidden almost entirely behind a curated, polished experience specifically designed to feel effortless, open, and relaxing, even though an enormous portion of the actual ship remains permanently, deliberately, and necessarily out of view. So, the next time you're standing near a door marked crew only, or notice a camera quietly tracking your walk down a hallway, remember what's actually happening just beyond your reach. An entire second version of the ship exists, running constantly, governed by rules, regulations, and safety concerns you'll never be given full access to. Not because the cruise line has something to hide, necessarily, but because some parts of running a floating city were simply never meant to be part of the show.